and welcome back. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a situation that's been generating a lot of concern from you listeners, the dynamics within the Eritrean diaspora, particularly what's happening in Switzerland.
You know what's fascinating about this is that we're not talking about the typical kind of adjustments you'd see in a diaspora community.
Yeah.
Just cultural differences or, missing home or something like that.
Right.
This is something else entirely. We're looking at a situation where the Eritrean government is extending its authority across borders, and that's impacting Eritreans even when they've sought refuge in other countries.
Yeah, reading through the sources that you sent over, I was really struck by that too. This idea that there's this extension of the regime's power and, we're seeing reports of intimidation, surveillance, even accusations of violence. So I think there's a lot to unpack here, but maybe a good place to start is just to get a sense of who the key players are in this situation.
Right. It's a complex landscape, but I think it boils down to two main factions within the diaspora, those who align with the current regime in Eritrea, which is led by the ruling PFDJ party, and those who oppose it. And this division is not just like a philosophical debate. It has very real and sometimes dangerous consequences.
Okay, so walk me through this. How does the Eritrean government manage to exert its influence so far beyond its own borders? I mean, we're talking about people who have fled the country, often at great personal risk. Why would they still be subject to this kind of control?
It's about power. It's
Right.
about maintaining control and suppressing dissent, even thousands of miles away. The Eritrean government sees the diaspora, especially those who criticize the regime, as a threat. So they've created this elaborate system of control, and it really relies on a combination of what you might call soft power and then just straight up coercion.
So when you say soft power, what do you mean? Is that more like cultural influence, or is this something a little more sinister?
I'd say it's a bit of both. They promote this idea of Eritrean unity, often using cultural events and, kind of nationalistic rhetoric to instill this sense of obligation and belonging. But underneath this veneer of, cultural celebration,
Yeah.
there's this darker undercurrent of pressure and control.
So how does that pressure actually manifest? What specific tactics are we talking about?
Well, for one thing, they establish parallel structures within the diaspora that mirror those in Eritrea itself. So think PFDJ branches, youth wings, women's groups, all kinds of organizations that operate directly under the regime's control.
Whoa, so it's like they're recreating Eritrea in miniature within these host countries.
Exactly. They also organize mandatory events, often disguised as cultural gatherings or festivals. And these events, they serve a dual purpose. On the surface, they're promoting Eritrean culture and heritage, but they're also used to collect funds, spread propaganda, and keep track of who's loyal to the party line.
So attendance isn't really optional then. What happens if someone chooses not to participate?
That's where the coercion kicks in. There's a very real fear of reprisal, not just for the individual living abroad, but for their family members back in Eritrea. The regime is known for collective punishment. So even if you've escaped, your loved ones can still be targeted because of your actions.
That's a scary thought, this idea that you can never really escape the regime's reach, even if you fled the country.
It's a constant pressure. And the reports you shared also point to this network of spies and informants operating within the diaspora, people who monitor and report on the activities of refugees, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear.
Wow, so even in countries where they should feel safe, they're living under this kind of shadow surveillance.
It's a way to control the narrative,
Yeah.
to make sure that dissenting voices are silenced and to really drive home the point that the regime's reach extends far beyond its borders.
And it seems like they've been particularly active in Switzerland. There are even reports of these groups, Bidho and Eri Blood, operating there.
Yeah, those groups are particularly concerning. They're often described as paramilitary forces, and they operate with a level of organization and discipline that points to direct links with the Eritrean government. Allegedly, they're involved in intimidation violence, even money laundering to fund the regime's activities.
Hold on, so we're not just talking about cultural pressure or financial coercion here. We're talking about actual physical threats?
That's what these reports suggest.
Yeah.
And it's crucial to understand the context here. Bido, which means youth, in Tigrinya. It was originally presented as this youth organization, focused on cultural activities, community service, that kind of thing.
Okay.
But over time, it's transformed into something far more sinister.
So it's a calculated move,
Yeah.
using these seemingly benign organizations to mask their true intentions.
Exactly. And it's effective because it plays on that sense of community and belonging that so many refugees crave after being forced from their homes.
That's really insidious. And what about Eri Blood? Where do they fit in?
Eri Blood are even more shadowy. They're considered to be a hardcore faction within the diaspora, known for their unwavering loyalty to the regime and their willingness to use violence to enforce its will.
This is starting to paint a pretty disturbing picture. It seems like this situation is much deeper and more complex than many people realize.
It is, and it raises some serious questions about the responsibility of host countries like Switzerland to protect refugees from this kind of transnational repression. But before we get into that, it's important to remember that not everyone is passively accepting this control. There's a growing resistance movement within the diaspora that's actively pushing back against the regime's tactics,
Mm.
right? It's not a homogenous community at all. You actually have a significant and growing number of Eritreans in the diaspora who are courageously pushing back against these tactics.
Yeah, it takes a lot of guts to stand up to a regime like that, especially when you consider the potential risks. What's driving them to take such a stand?
Well, I think it boils down to a deep desire for basic freedoms and human rights, both for themselves and for those who are still living under the regime's oppressive rule in Eritrea. They're tired of living in fear, constantly being intimidated and having their lives restricted. They want real change both within the diaspora and back home.
So, how do they go about challenging a regime as entrenched and seemingly powerful as the one in Eritrea? What are their strategies?
They're using a variety of tactics, some of which mirror those used by the regime itself, but with a very different end goal.
Hmm.
One key strategy is leveraging social media, using platforms like Twitter and Facebook to share information, connect with like-minded groups, and basically bypass the regime's propaganda machine.
That makes sense. Social media can be such a powerful tool for organizing and mobilizing people, especially when traditional media outlets are controlled by the state. But they're not just tweeting about it, right? There must be more to their resistance than just online activism.
You're absolutely right. They're also organizing protests and demonstrations, often targeting regime-sponsored events as a way to disrupt the government's activities and raise awareness among the international community.
So it's about making it harder for the regime to operate freely, both financially and politically. And it's not just about disrupting events, it's also about sending a message of defiance, showing that they're not afraid to speak out.
Exactly. And that defiance extends to their efforts to document human rights abuses and report them to authorities in their host countries.
So they're actually working to hold the regime accountable. They're not just complaining, they're gathering evidence of the regime's tactics, the financial extortion, the intimidation, the violence, and presenting that to law enforcement agencies and human rights organizations.
Right. And they're doing this despite the very real threat of retaliation, not just against themselves, but against their families back in Eritrea. It takes incredible courage to stand up to a regime like this.
It's a classic David versus Goliath story, but these individuals are proving that even the most powerful regimes can be challenged when people are determined to fight for their freedom.
And their efforts are starting to have an impact. We've seen instances where regime-sponsored events have been canceled due to pressure from these groups. The Eritrean government is definitely feeling the heat.
That's encouraging. It shows that their persistence is paying off, that they're making a difference. But it also highlights the fact that this conflict is far from over. It's an ongoing struggle for freedom, for dignity, for the right to dissent without fear of reprisal.
And that brings us back to the situation in Switzerland, which seems to be a real focal point in this conflict. The reports you shared paint a pretty alarming picture of the regime's activities in that country and the intensity of the resistance movement's response.
It seems like the Swiss case is particularly urgent. These refugees are pleading for help, for protection from this regime that still seems to haunt them, even in a country that's known for its neutrality and its commitment to human rights.
And their request is quite clear. They're calling on the Swiss authorities to launch a full-blown investigation into the regime's activities within their borders. They want an independent task force or a commission of inquiry, something with real teeth, to examine the evidence, hear testimonies from those who have been affected, and recommend concrete actions to protect refugees from this kind of transnational repression.
It's a bold request, but it seems entirely justified given the severity of the situation. They're essentially saying, we've trusted you with our safety, with our lives, and now we need you to act to protect us from this ongoing threat.
And their argument is grounded in both moral and legal principles. Switzerland has a responsibility both under international law and its own constitution to protect refugees from persecution. Turning a blind eye to what's happening within their borders would be a betrayal of that responsibility and could set a dangerous precedent.
It would send a message that authoritarian regimes can operate with impunity in democratic countries, using them as a staging ground to continue their repression. That would undermine the whole concept of asylum, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. It creates this chilling effect where refugees, no matter where they go, never truly feel safe.
Mm.
They're always looking over their shoulders, wondering if the regime's long arm will reach them, even in a country like Switzerland.
So the stakes are incredibly high, not just for the Eritrean refugees themselves, but for the integrity of the international system of asylum and for the very principles of human rights that Switzerland claims to uphold.
It's a critical moment. How the Swiss authorities respond to this situation will have far-reaching consequences, not just for the Eritrean community, but for the way we understand and address these challenges of transnational repression in a world that's becoming increasingly interconnected.
It's a lot to process. We've gone from these cultural events to accusations of paramilitary groups operating in Europe to this pretty high-stakes standoff in Switzerland.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex situation. And I think it raises some really fundamental questions about how we as a global community protect human rights. How do we ensure that people who have said persecution are actually safe? What are the limits of national sovereignty when a foreign government is actively trying to undermine the security and freedoms of individuals within your borders?
It's not just an Eritrean issue, it's a global challenge. But focusing on Switzerland for now, what are these refugees actually asking for? How can the Swiss authorities effectively address this?
Well, their main demand is a thorough and impartial investigation. They want the Swiss government to acknowledge the seriousness of the issue and commit to uncovering the full extent of the Eritrean regime's activities within Switzerland. So they're asking for an independent task force, something with real authority to gather evidence, interview witnesses, and really expose the truth.
It sounds like they're not just looking for a slap on the wrist. They want actual accountability. So what would that look like? What would that involve?
I think it would have to involve identifying and prosecuting individuals who are involved in these activities, whether they're Eritrean officials operating under diplomatic cover or even Swiss residents who are complicit in these schemes. And it would require addressing the financial aspect, tracing the money trails and shutting down any illicit operations that are funding the regime's repressive apparatus.
So following the money, exposing the networks, and bringing those responsible to justice. But what about the refugees themselves? What kind of support do they need to feel safe and start to rebuild their lives?
That's a crucial point. Even if the legal and financial aspects are addressed, there's still the psychological and social impact of this constant harassment and intimidation. These refugees need access to mental health services, trauma counseling support networks that can help them process their experiences and build new lives free from fear.
Yeah. It's recognizing that the trauma doesn't just vanish when you cross a border. These people are still carrying the weight of what they've been through, and they need ongoing support to truly heal and thrive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's not just about individual support either. It's also about creating a more welcoming and inclusive environment within Swiss society. So tackling discrimination, fostering intercultural dialogue, educating the public about the challenges that Eritrean refugees face. It's about building bridges of understanding instead of perpetuating divisions and suspicion.
This whole deep dive has really been eye-opening. It's so much more than just a story about one diaspora community. It's about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of oppression, the responsibility of democratic nations to protect those seeking refuge, and really the ongoing struggle to uphold human rights in a world where borders are becoming more and more fluid.
It's a story that's still being written, and the outcome will have a big impact on the future of human rights and the way we as a global community deal with transnational oppression in this increasingly interconnected world. And for our listeners out there, I encourage you to learn more about the situation in Eritrea and the challenges that refugees from authoritarian regimes face every day.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this conversation has given you a better understanding of the dynamics at play within the Eritrean diaspora and the challenges they're facing. We'll definitely continue to follow this story and provide updates as they develop. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.